Welcome to this talk on exploring the language about gender in video games, big data and corpus linguistics. This is our third talk in our series on variation in language. My name is Frazer Heritage, and you can either email me or tweet me at noun_phrase, and my email address is on this slide. On my Twitter, I have also uploaded an accessible version of this PowerPoint in case anyone is hard of hearing or in case there are any issues with sort of being able to understand what I'm saying. If you have any questions, please do feel free to post them in the Q&A section. And if you can't get your question answered, please feel free to get in touch at the end. OK, so today's talk. What we're going to be talking about is video games as a text and how the representation of gender varies within this genre of texts. So what we're going to start by doing is talking about the background theory to video games, specifically looking at the representation of gender within video games. And then I'm going to introduce something called corpus linguistics, which is a method which we can use to look at the representation of gender. We're then going to discuss a case study, and in this case study we're going to look at 4 words: he, she, man and woman. And then finally I'm going to wrap up the whole presentation by summarising the main points that we're going to make and talking about sort of the future research that's going on. So let's first turn to the history of video games. Now, on the left, we have 2 pictures. The first is Pong, that's the one in the top left, and the bottom left is from Tetris. Now, as you can see, there's not really that much language in these video games. It's pretty sparse on linguistic features. So when we look at video games, you might think, well, why are we looking at video games if there's no language? And a lot of people have these kind of video games in their mind when they think about this as a text. But when we jump forward to the 1990s, a lot more games were beginning to have things like text boxes and characters who were gendered. So on the right there, we have Pokemon and we have Final Fantasy VII. So already what we can see is in the span from when video games first started to be released to the 1990s, when they were becoming more popular, is an increase in the amount of language, and the technological affordances have allowed for characters to be constructed. Jump forward to even more recent games like The Witcher 3 released in 2015, what we have are almost movie-like graphics, we have voiceovers, and we have subtitles for those voiceovers. So ultimately what we see is that the narrative structures have become a lot more complex in video games since the 1970s. There's a lot more language in modern video games, and there are a load more graphics which are better. But with these technological developments come new affordances of the ways in which we can represent gender within video games. And in particular, there's a growing body of research which looks at how men and women are visually represented. So looking at the gendered body and looking at the roles in which men and women play in video games. So there's been a lot of research, particularly with female characters, and typically it's finding that women are things like damsels in distress or they're overly sexualized. So here we have Princess Peach from Mario, and she is the classic damsel in distress, needs rescuing, right? We have sexualized characters, so we've got 2B from Nier Automata. This is a very tame image, and actually if you are playing the game you can adjust the angle to look up her skirt, look down her top. She's a very highly sexualized character, and this is just a very sort of tame example. There are some which are much more sexualized. But this isn't necessarily a fair representation of gender on the whole, because we do have characters like Aloy from Horizon Zero Dawn. Now, as you can see with this final character, Aloy, she's not really that sexualized, is she? OK, she's a woman, but, you know, you can't see her breasts, you can't see her thighs. So is it really fair to say that women are always sexualized? So as a sort of summary on the previous research, just looking at visual representations of gender in video games, what we see is that, okay, women are frequently sexualized and they're frequently seen as victims, but this isn't always the case. There's also a very big focus on women as opposed to gender and also male characters. And something I would argue is that the focus on visual elements is actually quite problematic because the linguistic elements often get overlooked. So, for example, if we just go back 1 minute, if this middle character 2B had only ever been called amazing and wonderful, but Alloy on the right had only ever been called awful and abysmal, then there's a disconnect there between the linguistic representation of gender and the visual representation of gender. So while the visual representation of gender is really important within video games, we can't ignore that linguistic features also play a part in the ways in which gender is represented. And so my argument is that we need to look at the language about these gendered characters to get a deeper insight to see what's just going on here with the representation of gender. And this is really important in general because there is an impact and there is a relationship between the language we use in general, the language in video games, and views towards gendered people. So, for example, if script writers start writing characters as strong, so if they say men are strong, for example, and then that video game then portrays all the male characters as strong, players are likely to subconsciously accept that idea that, you know, men can only ever be strong, right? And so the player will start describing the men as strong themselves, which means that they'll begin to slowly accept that more and more and more. And so we have this unconscious bias going on here. And because players are starting to use that language, script writers will likely see it and think, oh, this is how it's viewed in general. And so we'll start to incorporate that into more games. So we've got this cyclical relationship here between the language used about gender, how it's represented, and then how it becomes normalized. But how do we know, for example, that men are represented as strong or that women are represented as being sexualized? It's really easy to cherry pick some examples and to overanalyze them. So, for example, where I just picked up 2B in the previous slide, that's a really easy way to sort of say, oh, yes, look, women are very sexualized, but it doesn't always account for the examples such as Alloy, the one that wasn't sexualized. And that's where corpus linguistics comes in. So in order to explore corpus linguistics, I think we first need to take a step back and look at what a corpus is. So the word corpus originates from the Latin word for body, and it's concerned with analysing bodies of texts. Now, within this study, what we do is we use computer software to look at patterns in language, more than what we would be able to do just by eye. So, for example, in this talk, I'll be using the software #Lancsbox, which is completely free to download and available via Lancaster University. We also run a yearly Corpus MOOC on FutureLearn on that, so do sign up to that if you are interested in corpus linguistics. But in essence, what Corpora is that it's a big data approach to language that uses computer software. And one of the underlying principles of corpus linguistics is that the data set that you're analysing, this big data, should be representative of the certain text type that you're analysing. So here, for example, I've put in a little diagram of a load of red boxes and 2 white boxes with question marks. Now, the likelihood is that we can say that what will be in those 2 white boxes with question marks is that if you were to take away the top layer would be that they're red, right? But even if they're not, the whole other side of all the red boxes are still worth analysing. And this is why using a representative corpus and representative samples is so important. If we apply this to gender and we say all the red boxes are instances where women are sexualized, then the likelihood is that that's going to be occurring a lot more often than just these 2 last little boxes. And even if those last 2 boxes are blue, then all those red ones are still valid and a useful bit to research. And in corpus linguistics, we have three basic methods of analysis. We use key word lists. So we generate all the words that are in the corpus, and we can look at what is salient that way. We also do collocation and concordance line analysis. Now, for this talk, we're only going to be talking about collocations and concordance line analysis. So collocation. A collocate is a statistically significant word that is more likely to occur with another word, and it can have really important gendered consequences. So just take 5 or 6 seconds and just think of an adjective to come before the words bachelor, spinster, and bachelorette. Okay, so the likelihood is you probably thought of something like an eligible bachelor, a frigid or maybe an old spinster, and maybe something like a noisy bachelorette. So here, as you can see, we have some sort of gender bias going on, right? What we have is a particular view to bachelors, spinsters, and bachelorettes, even though in theory they all mean the same thing. They're all a noun that denote a non-married gendered person. And where concordance line analysis comes in is that we need to check these concordance lines. So, for example, if the word man occurred with the word bitchy, then we would need to check that, because we can get examples where we have things like, I heard that man called her bitchy. So the man here isn't being described as bitchy, the man is calling someone else bitchy. And it's also really important because we can look at prosodies. So although words may not statistically be likely to occur with one and another, words which have a similar concept might be occurring. So here, what we look at is something called discourse or semantic prosody. So we have words like, he is annoying, he is a nuisance, he has been getting on my nerves all day. We have a certain representation of this man here as annoying, right? But it's lexicalized, so the words used to describe it are different in each circumstance. So we need to check all of these concordance lines to build up these bigger pictures. So now that you sort of know the very sort of underlying research that has gone on in gender and video games, and what a corpus is, and the kind of measures that we use in corpus linguistics, let's now turn to our case study. First, let's talk about getting the data, because this is quite a difficult thing in corpus linguistics, and particularly with video games. A lot of video games have player choice. So a player might have some on-screen dialogue and they may be given, the option, will you help a poor woman? And they might be given 3 options, yes, no, and I need to think. Now, depending on what they choose, the dialogue output from that character might be different. So you might have things like, yeah, I'll help a poor woman, or no, why would I want to help a poor woman? And that creates different representations here. And so this is another reason, and something that's really important with representativeness, is we can't just say only ever take option 1 for every single option, because that way we're missing out on a lot of different options that players might be getting. So really what we need to try to do is get as many of these different permutations as possible for our corpus. And really there are 3 ways to gather all these different permutations. The first, which I tend to do, is use computers to code and program all of these different permutations and put it all into one file, and that becomes our corpus. Another way is to play through all of these and transcribe them all as we go. So creating a load of different save files, playing through, getting all that data ourselves, and then putting all that into the corpus. And the third way is to actually rely on fans who actually transcribe this just because they love the game so much. So I've built this corpus of about 330,000 odd words from fantasy video games published between 2012 and 2016. Now, this is quite small for a corpus, but it will do the job just to give us a snapshot of fantasy video games. So let's start by looking at the word he. So what we're going to do is we put into our corpus search he, and we look at all the words that are statistically likely to occur with it. And this is what we get. So the MI score here is the statistic that shows the significance. And then we've got frequencies as well. But this is quite complex to just look at. It's quite garish, really. So what we can do is we can semantically group them. So look at the kind of ideas that they're presenting. And really, we have two main categories of these collocates. The first is to do with actions. So what we're seeing here is that male characters are doing actions. And then we also have a second one of things to do with war and violence. So, rifles, detainees, snipers. And it's important to look at these concordance lines because we have things like he murdered Ben Hasrath, he drew blood. And what we see is that in a random sample of 100 concordance lines for he, 30 were about men enacting some sort of violence. So we also get this idea, firstly, of how these words are used, but also this broader picture which doesn't just rely on collocates. And so here we already have a difference from the previous research, which wasn't really looking at the way men are represented, but what we see is that when they are represented, they're being represented as the perpetrators of violence, which is quite bad in terms of ideals towards masculinity. Now, again, when we look at she, by contrast, what we see is, again, another very garish picture. So let's look at the semantic categories of that. And what we see is typically she relates to various bits to do with other people, to do with thinking, and again, past tense verbs. And when we check the concordance lines, something we see quite a lot are relationships coming up for women. So she and I have a special relationship, things to do with wanting a child, things about someone's, again, that she gave birth to someone, etc. So here we have a difference in the ways in which men and women are represented through just looking at the pronouns he and she. But what we can also see is that there is a bit of a resistant discourse. So, things that go against this idea. So we do have a few examples where women are actually the perpetrators of violence. So, she hits hard or she's tough, but this is much rarer in comparison to the language about violence for men. So we do have some similarities, but it is generally on the whole quite different. So in sum, what we see is that he's typically occurring with more words relating to violence and war. She tends to be more about relations and mental processes. But what I want to quickly do is now turn to agency. So an agent is someone that does a verb, has some sort of transformative action on the world. And it's really important to look at agency because it's this idea that, it is the people that are responsible for creating change in the world. And there's quite a lot of research onto the idea of feminist agency, that, women should also be able to be the doers of verbs. But we do have an issue here with corpus linguistics. So because we're using computers, it can really only handle a single word or a few collections that don't really have that much change in their orthography. But grammatically, he and she are quite problematic when we want to look at semantic transitivity. So, if we look at where they come in a subject-object-verb position, we have things like she kicked the ball. So we've got the woman as the agent here. And although the woman is the patient in the second example, the ball hit her, we can see that there's a change in the way it's the grammatical form. So she becomes her. So what we do instead is we look at terms which can stay the same. So, for example, the woman kicked the ball hit the woman. And what we see is that typically men tend to be the ones to do verbs more, and they have them done upon them a fair amount, but not as much as what they do. And what we see is that women have verbs done upon them a lot more than what they actually do the verb. So men are the doers at about 57%, but women have things done upon them at 66%. So we could possibly argue that some women are being seen as less capable than men, or that women are seen as the passive recipient of certain actions. So really, all I've been able to do today is give you a very broad snapshot into video games, the ways in which we can use corpora and this big data approach to look at the language around gendered pronouns and nouns. And this kind of research isn't necessarily a whole by itself. We will need to start looking at comparing this to visual analysis, but what we do get is a sense of representation that isn't possible to just get from visual analysis alone. So, for example, while the previous visual analysis was showing that women are frequently sexualized, we're not really seeing that in the language around women. What we are seeing, however, is the language around women in terms of their relations. We've also started to look at the representation of men, because that is also an important aspect to gender. And what we're seeing is a representation of violence, so it's still quite problematic. So there is a variation in the language here, and it can sustain some problematic ideologies. What we also now need to do, though, is look across more games and get more data and start to look at the ways in which different kinds of women and different kinds of men are represented. And that's just about everything.